Hello, so I'm Krissie Barrick. I'm the head of digital influencing at Scope. I've been running a program which we're calling the Big Hack, and the idea with that program is that we work with the tech industry and with the disabled community to make sure that tech is much more fit for purpose for disabled people and usable. It's been a year in the making. It's been first and foremost a collaborative program, and as you'll see tonight, I really want to work with you guys in the room. I think it's really important for us that we really understand the behaviours and the needs of our audience who we intend to influence, and then we can make sure that we have the best offer for supporting you to make sure that you're making really inclusive and accessible products. So, I'm not going to go on about me. I really do want to hear more from you guys. I know you've just been asked to do surveys and Slido, but I'm going to ask you to do another thing, I'm afraid. So basically, in part of our research for the Big Hack, Scope has been developing personas, and this really helps us when we build. We're basically building a digital support offer to people to help them practice inclusive design and accessibility, and basically those personas really help us understand how that can work and how best to engage with people. So I'm going to run through the personas, and I reckon some of you in this room will identify quite closely with those, and some of you may not and think, oh, you've missed me out. But what we're really keen for you to do is tweet us with #BigHack. I'll give some more instructions as I do the personas, just telling us a little bit more about your experience. So, first persona we've got here is the Google Sprinter. You may hear the Google Sprinter saying, "We are at the minimum standard for accessibility and people haven't seen any reason to go further." There are barriers to practicing inclusive design, to making their product accessible. Those might be perceived time and difficulty in designing for accessibility in a busy agency environment, knowledge in the team and resource to work on perceived extra workload, lack of senior buy-in, physical infrastructure that's part of the service that the team have no influence over, for example, ticket machines. So getting your ticket is not all online. Often you have to go and collect it from the ticket. That could be inaccessible too. And things that they need are simple tools and patterns that fit into their current workflow to make it easier for them to consider inclusive design, and perhaps the business case to convince their boss that it's important. Does anyone think that sounds familiar? Yeah? You're going to see another one in a minute that's really familiar to you because I know they rang you. Okay. So what we're asking is, what will influence this Google Sprinter? They're not going into work going, accessibility, it's got to be something we do. Whereas actually that's how we want people to feel about accessibility. So what do you think are their barriers and needs to prioritising accessibility? Do you know anyone who is the Google Sprinter who you could put us in touch with? Please tweet with #BigHack, #Google Sprinter. And I'll put these up again at the end. Then there's the accessibility advocate. There's one sat in the front row there, who might say, I just say I'll do it. Sometimes it works to show videos of people struggling, but it often means me as a lone wolf working on the weekend to do this sort of thing. Barriers: selling the business case of inclusive design and getting buy-in from senior stakeholders whose main focus is the bottom line. Difficulty in prototyping physical infrastructure. Needs: guidance or principles from someone with a voice of authority, for example GDS, Scope, so it's not just me on my own selling the value of this approach. Also needs a community for designers to loop back in and share experience of what worked and what didn't on their projects, or perhaps knowledge of the community. So what will help the accessibility advocate? If you feel like you're one of them, what are your perceived barriers and needs to getting accessibility prioritised in the business that you're in? Tweet it with BigHack and A1Y advocate. Okay, developer. Hands up, who's developer? Yeah, saw a few earlier. Okay, cool. So this might sound like you. I mean, yeah, it sounds a little bit mean actually, but I think for a lot of people, if they don't know about accessibility, it's fine that that would sound like them. I don't want to waste lots of time making something really clunky for a small amount of people. My priority is to make it look really slick for the majority of people who will use it. Barriers probably don't know about accessibility, maybe don't know any disabled people, so don't really understand what the frustration looks like when they're trying to use a website and there's all kinds of barriers that have been put in their way that don't need to be there. Accessibility not a priority. If I can use it, anyone can. I think we're all guilty of this, designing in our own image. Needs to be respected as a developer and get recognition for my talent, to be seen as innovative and on board with best practice. Well, feel free to challenge this or add to it by tweeting us with #BigHack, #developer, with what you perceive as their barriers and needs. And the last one, the disability champion. I'm really happy to be a spokesperson. One of my passions is to make the world more accessible, and we need to speak up if we want change. Barriers, fluctuating energy levels, cost to participate, other life priorities. Needs, allow me to tell my story in my own way and respond with action. I've got allow me to tell me story there, but hey. Give me enough warning so I can plan my travel. Ensure the venue is fully accessible and caters for my needs. So anyone who wants to go and practice inclusive design, it's really important to take note of this. And also, if you feel like this is you, then do please tweet us with more information or any challenges to that persona. Tweet with #BigHack, #disabilitychampion. So that's on here, #Google Sprinter, A1Y advocate, developer, disability champion, or you might be something else. So I know we've got a few content people here, and actually the perspective might be different if your job is focused on content. So in the break, plenty of time to hashtag this, and then at the end we'll have some time to feedback what we've heard. Again, this is really, really valuable to us in our work, so please just go ahead. What you have to say is really important. So now I'm going to hand you over to Steve Tyler, who has a fascinating talk which runs through his experience in this area.
Turn on the mic. Thanks.
I'll stand next to you.
So I'm hoping Chris is going to drive the slides. We've got a logo up. Is that where we are?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Older joke, but you were expecting Aerosmith. I know you were. It's okay. I'm not going to trash the theatre. Sadly, you've got me, and it's all about accessibility. Maybe a slightly odd take, but we'll get to that in a second. So, next slide. I've entitled this particular talk, Assistive Technology, Saviour or Threat? And part of the reason for doing that is that I'm one of these odd breed of people, there aren't many of us, I think, who are paid to worry about the state of where things are, what things ought to be, and how do we get there. So next slide. I'm Steve Tyler. I suppose I've been around long enough to have engaged in lots and lots of things to do with disability, accessibility in the technology area. My background is clinical psychology, but I kind of got hijacked by technology and everything that it could deliver. And when I very first witnessed what it was like to log on to a server halfway across the world, I realized that this held so much possibility for people with disabilities. But there needed to be something in there that would ensure we got a fair crack of the whip in terms of access. I've worked on lots of things from the voice of Alexa, which I'll come back to that because it was part of the strategy to bring about accessibility in Amazon products, right through to delivery of TV into the UK and then on into the US which was accessible. So the latest Samsung devices and a range of others, Panasonic, etc., are all testament to the teamwork that brought all of that about. Worked in the banking sector, payment systems, the retail area, had a fair amount to do with Sainsbury's and Barclays in my time. Autonomous vehicles, EPUB, and accessibility to the written word. Believe it or not, until very recently, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I was lying in bed and did something which quite astonishing, really. I was listening to a podcast on my iPod, and they mentioned a book. And I, without really thinking about it, went on to the iBook store, searched for the book, found it, bought it, downloaded it, and there it was. And I realized that I'd never, ever been able to do that before. The traditional model would be that I would wait at a minimum for about 18 months before I could get a book that I could read. And of course, that depended on whether or not there was enough demand for it. And in fact, myself and a friend used to bet each other as we were beginning to change the publishing industry and working with publishers to bring about EPUB and what started off as DAISY, Digital Accessible Information System, which was a global movement. We didn't know that it would be EPUB then, but we knew what needed to happen. And we used to test each other, and I used to say really weird things to Richard as we were walking along a random road somewhere in a random place across the world. And I'd say things like, okay, so I would like to read The Wasp Factory by Ian Banks. I don't mind how you get hold of it, but it has to be in a format I can read. Go. And we would time how long it would take before you could get such a thing. Next slide. So what I want to talk to you about, this is about Leonard Cheshire, and I just want to introduce the organisation just a little bit, just so you know who I'm working for today, but just a little bit of an intro as well to what I'm about to talk about, which is the broad nature of where we are today with technology, the importance of paying attention to where we are, because we can be wrong-footed very quickly. What about accessibility, and where is it? And what impact, what do we need to be paying attention to? And it seems to me that actually a lot of what we need to be paying attention to is ourselves and our own behaviours, rather than the technology, although the technology plays an enormously important part because it's a big driver of change. Leonard Cheshire, our broad mantra is that we want to bring about a situation where, bring about a world where people can live, learn and work in the manner they choose. We run 150 services across the country, from living accommodation through to supporting people through education and getting a degree through university, right through to getting a job. So we run apprenticeship schemes of all kinds. We're a pan-disability organisation in the biggest sense you can imagine. We touch around 40,000 people's lives a year. There are about 4,000 people that live in our residences, and those people range from people who are virtually non-communicative or entirely non-communicative, and it's not clear whether they are there or not in any meaningful sense, and I'll come back to that too, right through to people who are pretty much okay and live a pretty ordinary life, except when the chips are down, they really are down. So they might have a muscle spasm problem or a musculoskeletal problem, which means that when they collapse, they need immediate assistance now. But for 99.5% of the time, you wouldn't even know. Next slide. So technology today, well, you don't need me to tell you this, but it's perhaps worth reminding us of what technology has done to us today. But we've changed our expectations of life and of everything we do, really. The increase in change and the pace of change is vast. We live in a world where Google is a verb. We live in a world where online entertainment means that we want instant gratification. If it doesn't work immediately, we move off the website. Amazon has completely revolutionized the shopping experience and has set a benchmark around what online shopping is. And the connected home has basically merged with reality. We don't really think of things anymore as separate from each other as we might have done 4 or 5 years ago. Some things used to be very much in the online universe, some things very much not. And now it's not quite clear where the blurring begins and ends. Banking, citizenship, transactional systems of all kinds have begun to be optimized online. And they're hugely important elements to everything we do and the way we operate as a nation, as a society. Next slide. And the infrastructure. So we've got the connected environment, we've got the hardware that hosts it, we've got the software that drives it, and they're becoming very complex, very interrelated, with a deal of mutual reliance. And we've seen some of that, where intermittently the net goes down. We were promised not long ago that that could never happen. We were told that this was an impossibility because of the way the internet was constructed. As it turns out, that was an outright lie. And it was a marketing ploy. The product we carry around in our pocket, it's maybe worth remembering, especially given where we are 50 years on, has more power in it than the entirety of NASA had at its disposal around technical capacity. AI, machine learning, big data and data analytics, they're the order of the day. But they're buzzwords and a lot of people don't really understand what they mean. But suffice to say that they are operating in all kinds of environments, from the energy we use without even thinking and the supply of that, to logistics that controls how Amazon, how anybody that delivers anything online delivers. And there's a continual morphing and changing of business cases, business models, and the biggest companies can rise or fall without even realizing what's gone on. And good examples, I've used Nokia here. You know, Nokia started off life, amongst other things, in the paper industry. And when their directors sat round a table thinking, you know, the printed word, the environmental effects of using trees to print, maybe there's a new way of doing it now in the oncoming connected universe. And they had a good old discussion and a brainstorming and lots of flip charts, and they came up with this notion that you could carry something about in your pocket that would revolutionize the way we did everything. It wouldn't just be a communication aid, it would change the environment you lived and worked in. It would be your go-to thing that operated the world around you. And they took this idea to a very large company which will remain nameless in London and said, you know, what do you think of it? This is a pretty damn good idea, isn't it? But we need you to do due diligence on it and tell us what you think. And they came back after lots of research about 9 months down the track and said, yeah, all very interesting, guys, but you know, you're really better off doing something else. I mean, our estimate is that you would probably sell about 150,000 units globally. So, frankly, you ought to do something else. Anyway, they tore up that report, carried on, and became the biggest global mover in the mobile market. And those of you who are around long enough to remember it was Nokia and Ericsson. And now look, Nokia disappeared very, very quickly. Kodak, it was a household name. They made the mistake of thinking that digital really wasn't going to happen. It was all a flash in the pan, and people would just get with the program, and photographs would always be hugely important in a physical form. Look at Toys R Us. The high street has been affected in ways we never envisaged. And just a thought, if people had been listening more to the accessibility community in the days when Amazon was still a very small organisation focused on delivering books and CDs, then we might not be having quite the same conversations around the demise of the high street. I mean, it may be fine. We may be all happy with the demise of the high street. But the point is, we've got no choice anymore because it's happening. Government didn't pay attention around what was actually going on and couldn't foresee where that was going. Next slide. I just want to talk briefly about the big ethical, cultural, moral impacts that we're all subject to in some of the stuff that's going on today, and in particular is important to people with disabilities. Accessibility is an obvious issue. Accessibility is increasingly tricky, though. It's very difficult to define what accessibility is, and you have to be deeply immersed in it, really, to understand what it is. And in any case, our market research shows that people with disabilities quite often don't really understand what we're on about when we talk about accessibility. In fact, some of the latest findings would say we're not really interested in accessibility. What we're interested in is something that I can use. And for some people, accessibility means something big and probably horrible that they don't want in their house, probably coloured orange and black. Reliability and longevity of a solution, well, you know, that doesn't happen very often these days. Software comes and goes. There is a continual updating process across all platforms. Apps can come and go, depending on when people get bored, or there's not money in it, or they just decide they don't want to do it anymore. Data and control and the rights of the individual. And what about those individuals who have rights? It's just that they can't express them, or they require people to support them in the expression of them. Freedoms and engagement. The power of social media and the impact of social media and new social platforms on the way we engage socially with each other. Interestingly, we've done a piece of work recently where we've noticed quite a horrible trend where employers do a trawl around social media to try and deduce whether or not people have a disability. And if they have, they're screened out of the employment process before they even get there. Next slide. So this is a dangerous slide. What's coming? So you're either mad or deluded or something to try to predict some of this stuff. So I've tried to stick to the areas that I'm most confident about and then maybe go a bit left field on you at the end. So 5G connectivity, well, what does that mean? We're told faster, better, more slick connectivity, in fact, faster than cable in some cases. I think we ought to watch that one a little bit because we've still not quite got the mobile network we need of today. And to get 5G, we need blanket coverage of enormous proportions. So what I suspect will happen is urban communities will get high speed, and even within urban communities, very central ones will get very high speed, not so much for a while for the rural communities, but it's a nice dream, and it will eventually happen. I suspect it will take longer than we imagine. more elaborate home automation and control, and already we're beginning to see our homes becoming monitored, cameraed, wired for sound, and you know, alerts that come at you all the time. I get continual alerts about my Nest security system and who's coming and going, and whether or not the house is safe or otherwise. But those things are set to increase, more and more products becoming connected and feeding data, and that data being interpreted by wider solutions. 3D printing. 3D printing, I think, is enormous around personalization, and potentially is a massive disruptor of traditional manufacturing models. You know, we've seen it in the publishing industry where you might not realize, but as part of the work we did around EPUB and the broader push around electronic publishing, you know, if you order a book today from Amazon in print, chances are it was produced especially for you in Milton Keynes by a company called Lightning Source, bagged up and sent to you as if it's a book off the shelf. Actually, it was produced especially for you. And those models, I believe, will begin to find their way into everyday manufacturing. And in theory, it will give us optimal design for the kind of uses that we might need. Robotics and physical support systems. We can already see that car manufacturers are beginning to rechristen themselves as mobility providers rather than car manufacturers. And, you know, there's a lot of money and energy being put in by people like Toyota and so on, who have set up challenges to bring on the new types of vehicles that are emerging. Autonomous vehicles and traditional transport infrastructure massively changing. So imagine what if, when we see the autonomous vehicle really take off, and the step changes that will occur over the coming few years to bring that about. What does that mean for some of the wider transport infrastructure? You won't need train stations or bus stations on quite the scale they are today, because it will be an on-demand set of solutions. What does that do to the property prices, for example, that currently pride themselves on being connected hubs? There will be very major changes that we've not really been paying attention to. Even more seamless payment and transactional infrastructures. And I mean, you know, we're already seeing those in so many ways. The latest, I guess, with contactless, but now there's, you know, things like Apple Pay and all the Android ecosystem, Samsung Pay. And then there's this kind of morphing that's beginning to happen with the advent of the Apple credit card, which, yes, is a physical product, but it also relies on a non-physical product. Diagnosis, genetics, and bioengineering, and along with the coming together of biological systems and chipsets, and the advances that that will bring in prosthetics for people with disabilities, and that blending of the biological world and the electronic world. So a bit of left field for you. A published proposition is that by 2030 there will be brain-to-cloud direct interface. Indeed, Elon Musk is working on a prototype of exactly that now. And the side benefit is a better brain, a better, faster brain, where you don't even have to think about whether or not you thought of the solution, because you'll be very neatly blended in with the ecosystem that is the cloud. Next slide. So what about assistive technology? What's all that about? Well, definitions are very blurry about assistive technology, and, you know, I have been working in this field for a very long time and have been a massive advocate of where we are today, which is that Apple and Microsoft and Google and big manufacturing entities like Samsung are delivering accessibility in spades. And the downside of that, if there is one, is that those accessibility products that are coming on the market, they solve challenges for those who are able to get their heads around them or their physical selves around them. And there are connectivity options for some of these things where, you know, for example, Windows has made it possible, Windows infrastructure has made it possible for very tight integration between a new kind of breed of product which takes advantage of the Windows ecosystem but completely amends the interface. So a simple example is a thing called My Guide, which is a homegrown product in the UK, little company called Dolphin, who've basically made a very, very simple version of Windows for people that are not very technically able or technically literate. Or another example, Grid 3, a complete revolution in communications capability for those people that can't communicate traditionally. This device runs on Windows, but it looks absolutely nothing like Windows. Instead, it can be completely personalized and will interact with virtually any device that's available for any potential physical or cognitive thing. So it responds to eye movement, and if that's all you can move, you can control the computer system. You can do everything from simple tasks like turn the TV over, turn the lights on or off, decide who to let into your house, through to a PowerPoint presentation. But accessibility providers are amalgamating, so those specialist businesses who existed are really finding it difficult to survive. So they're buying each other out and becoming more major players and less specialized. And I think the market is becoming quite confusing. But the end result is that although there is lots of resource and expense around the industry available to entities like Apple, for example, they're finding it difficult to penetrate users' consciousness around accessibility. People are still quite confused about the difference between an accessible product and now what is no longer an accessible product but an everyday widget. You know, so in the case of Apple, people get confused when you talk about voiceover for blind people and a screen reader that speaks to you. They say, oh yeah, oh you mean Siri, don't you? No, but it's just too confusing and people don't really pay much attention. And right at the other end of the spectrum, where people need it most, actually we're seeing a real dip in development and innovation. So those people that I talked about right at the beginning, those people with the more serious disability, more major cognitive impairments, more significant communication problems, they're beginning to be left out in the cold. It's a traditional idea from marketing gurus around the world, even now, that disability is difficult. It's just a difficult area to me. It's too complicated. There are too many different types of it. And boy, they're not wrong. I mean, there are several thousand conditions that are broadly categorized as blindness. When you start merging blindness with autism, that becomes a very complex situation. When you start talking about the variations in learning disability and physical disability, it is a complicated area. And we don't help as a disability community. I'll come back to that. So what strategies, next slide, sorry. what strategies work to bring about mainstream development. And I've spent, I suppose, as it turns out, most of my life, I didn't realise, I mean, I didn't set out to do that, but it seemed to me that it was hugely important to focus on how far could we push mainstream accessibility, or the mainstreaming of accessibility, and then what do we do with the rest of the world? What do we do with the area that's left where mainstream will not go there because it's just too complicated? And on the slide I've given examples of the kind of thing we've done, whether it's working with accessibility to the published word, right through to TV and Amazon accessibility. And the kind of techniques include understanding the business drivers, hugely important, obvious, but hugely important. I think the disability sector wasn't very keen on understanding business drivers, almost an alien concept really, but without understanding the business drivers and how decisions were made in mainstream companies, and not just that, but the infrastructure that drove them. So for example, when we were working on TV, it became very clear that, you know, a lot of the big companies were really brands. Actually, the guys that really drove what the technology was were these very mysterious organizations known as middleware companies. And these are the guys that hold all the cards, as it turns out. They're the guys who decree what can go in boxes and what can work together, at what price point. And so, you know, brands will approach these middleware guys and say, right, well, we want something to retail at £499. This is what we want in the box. These are the types of products. This is the thing that we want it to look like. And these are the capabilities of it. What can you do? And then there's a barter and a negotiation. And eventually they kind of get most of what they want or some of what they want, depending on how ridiculous the ask was. The business case development being linking accessibility to mainstream success. So a really good example of that is search optimization that brings accessibility to the top of any search. So if you do a search on Google, search optimization is hugely important. But to do search optimization nicely, and the best of search optimization can be done by making sure, as it turns out, that your website is accessible, because it relies on searchable data. It relies on data being optimized to be found and linked, and then, and obviously what Google is trying to do is find you the closest term that you're looking for. But there are lots and lots of other examples. Just step back for a second. In the disability sector, you know, we're steeped in examples of this kind, where, you know, the typewriter was built by an Italian engineer for his blind girlfriend who got fed up with dictating love letters to him to friends. So he made her a device that she could write her own love letters. The second reason given for the adoption of the gramophone in the patents was talking books for the blind. The optical character recognition system was developed by a guy called Ray Kurzweil, who's still alive and well today. And I remember the very first one. It was a scanner, or OCR system, which today sits on a desktop for 50 quid, then cost 47 grand and was about the size of a fridge. It was about 1982. Standards development, hugely important, because to make things work, you need to engage with the standards guys and make it make sense, make what you're suggesting make sense. Sometimes regulation, sometimes global decision making. I mean, essentially, if you want to influence Google and Microsoft and Apple and Samsung, you've got to go to the US or Korea or wherever they live That's where the decisions are taken, and those decisions are far-reaching and global. And a focus on human beings that make what corporates are. I mean, we think of companies as, and we refer to them as corporates, bodies of people. Actually, they're made up of people like me and you. And as it turns out, surprise, surprise, those people at most senior level who have been touched by disability or touched by an illness, they quite often get it. And if they get it, as it turns out, the rest of the company gets it too. We've worked on things like structured negotiation, new ways of talking to businesses. It's a kind of legalistic way of dealing with things, but it means that we all know where we are. There was a time when everyone talked about corporate social responsibility, and that is becoming more important again as it happens as a result of the environmental imperative and so on. And just as a sideline, I think we're beginning to win the day when employers and service providers think and talk about people with disabilities in exactly the same way they think and talk about the importance of the environment or the importance they have around the importance on race relations or the gender gap. And then ultimately, of course, there's court action. It's a bit silly in the UK, just out of interest. It seems to me that, you know, take Barclays, take our sponsors, take Sainsbury's. I mean, if Sainsbury's doesn't comply with disability legislation such that it is, as a service provider, okay, it can get into trouble. But actually, there's a lot that Sainsbury's simply can't do anything about, because as the service delivery agency, there is a focus on the service provider, but yet it sells manufactured products. Well, they're not touched by legislation around accessibility. So despite how much you want to hit Sainsbury's over the head for not delivering you an accessible product, it's actually not a great deal it can do. Next slide.
About 5 minutes.
So innovating specialist technology, I just think we need to take more control in determining our futures. And the organisations that represent us need to step up to the challenge. We need to make it less confusing for business. We need to collaborate with each other, and I've got endless examples of where collaboration really works. We're joining forces with a single focus. You know, we recently worked on I'm using a note taker here, which is a little braille display-based thing. Pins that move up and down that form braille, for those that don't know. A very simple device, complex because of the braille bit, but you know, it's $3.5 grand for 18 characters of braille. That's a bit like, you know, imagine covering up your screen and having a little slot with a window with 18 letters that you move about the screen. That's what I'm using here. Now, £3,500 is a lot, but we know that it's hugely important as a concept for literacy development and holding down a job, frankly. So we set about changing the world around bringing down the costs. There were 67 projects, none of whom were talking to each other, all working on the same thing and all spending vast amounts of money. What we did was brought a global alliance together to crack the problem. Clearly identifying need and attracting solution providers and researchers. Universities are great. We haven't got a single portal where people can go to find out what the challenges really are. And market disruption, hugely important. Open source is a well understood concept in software land, but you know, open design is coming to hardware. Hackathons and hacks, hugely important. The new mechanisms for helping us prove concepts and get stuff onto the market. And of course, hugely important, user engagement and making the sector more attractive. there's 250 billion pounds of expenditure to be had in the 14.4 million people that live with disabilities in the UK. That is not a niche market. Next slide. So just a very quick thing here. Current funding models, I mean, you know, broadly, there is access to work, which is a funding mechanism for people in employment who have disabilities. There's a similar thing for students. There's a specialist entity around National Health Service. When they all work, they're fantastic. But a lot of the time they don't work. The assessments that are made are incorrect, and people lose out on all kinds of things. We need to change all of that to become much more person-centred. Next slide. We're currently doing 2 pieces of work which I don't have an enormous amount of time to tell you about at Leonard Cheshire, but what they focus on are new ways of bringing about accessibility and effectively a new world for people living in their own homes and in ours. Next slide. Predictive health analytics is becoming a hugely important area. We're working with a company called MySense that sets out to monitor your home unobtrusively and provide, through artificial intelligence, predictive information about things that are likely to happen to you based on the signs and symptoms that it's seeing. And then next slide. And we're also adopting a second project centred around a person-centred approach. So this is about putting people right at the centre of what we're doing, rather than categorising them into different types of disabilities, thinking about them as are they in employment, are they in education, well, these are the funding mechanisms you need to go through. Instead, thinking more about them as individuals with a plan, individuals that if only they even knew what the options were, they might just choose to take some of the ones that are on offer. A lot of the time they don't even know what's on offer and they're not available, even if they did know. Next slide. I think there needs to be cultural change. So although technology is influencing culture big style, more than, and as I mentioned earlier, this is set to continue at a faster and faster pace. You know, we live in a society that currently doesn't easily accept diversity and difference. And sometimes technology is being used against that idea. We did a survey recently of managers who, bear in mind who we are, we're a disability organisation, because it says it on the tin, Leonard Cheshire Disability. 22% of managers, recruiting managers, said we would not recruit a person with a disability. But the stats are bleaker when you look at what actually is going on. 73% of people that involuntarily lose their job do so because of a long-term health condition or an acquired disability. We're in 2019, we're in the 5th strongest economy on the planet, so we're led to believe. What's all that about? So we need to change the culture, and we need to change the way we think about it. And some organisations are doing that in spades, changing the way they think about diversity, because actually, if you change the way you think about diversity and employ people with diversity that actually reflect the society we live in, you've got half a chance of delivering product that they can use as well. Next slide. What are we doing about it? Well, we're doing all sorts of things that I mentioned before. We're running apprenticeship schemes. We're arguing for new methods around funding. We're rethinking benefits, and we want to move to a place where diversity is seen as business critical and not something that you'd prefer not to do. Next slide. So what do blind people want to read? what does a wheelchair user want to do? And the answer to that is whatever everyone else does. There's no difference. And we still, too many times, get asked those questions in the disability community. But we need to inform people, we need to inform society and culture in new ways and use new methods for doing that, including some of the new social media and some of the technology at our disposal. We need to unify our messaging much more. We need to become much more savvy around shared agendas and shared communities. And rather than being subject to the winds of change, we need to begin to control where they're going. Last slide, thank you. And you can contact me at steve.tyler@leonardcheshire.org. And I keep forgetting it doesn't have a UK at the end, so don't do that. Cheers. I'll ask you a question.
Okay, nothing on the website, so go ahead.
Did what I said make sense? Does it resonate with you guys? Yes. Well, that's good enough for me.